The Vancouver Island Economic Alliance is all about achieving a vital and sustainable island region economy. We collaborate with stakeholders to solve problems and promote opportunities. Every October, VAIA hosts the State of the Island Economic Summit, a meeting place for ideas where you can network with decision makers and be informed of relevant grassroots trends in the island economy. VAIA's annual economic report is the only publication of its kind in Canada. It is user-friendly and puts important, timely data at your fingertips. Foreign Trade Zone Vancouver Island provides ready access to Canada's duty and tax deferral opportunities and attracts foreign direct investment to the island region. And the Island Good brand, created by VAIA, makes it easy for shoppers to find local products and is proven to increase sales for island producers. If it's Island Good, whether it's potatoes or gin or mattresses, it's good for our economy, good for sustainability, and good for us all. VAIA, a nonprofit membership organization that leads creation of transformative economic opportunities.
Hello, everybody. It's me again. I'm Erin, the Manager of Communications and Engagement with Cascadia Seaweed, and I'm sure most of you are tired of hearing me say that. I'd like to welcome you to our next industry speaker series during Seaweed Days. I'm telling you, day 5 has been packed with some amazing speakers. I have not had to refill my coffee today. It is the amazing speakers that have been keeping me going. So thank you. And thank you to our participants who have been bouncing from one session to the next today. I really appreciate your time that you've taken out to join us during Seaweed Days. I'd like to thank VAIA, the team behind the scenes who are delivering the industry speaker series for us. Thank you to George and Diana and Selena and all the support at VAIA. I've got to say, George, if you're on the call, I love the mattresses bit in the VAIA video. It always makes me chuckle. Cascadia Seaweed has had the pleasure of working with Oceans 2050 most recently, and we're on a mission to quantify how much carbon is sequestered by seaweed farming. And because of that relationship and the respected organization that Oceans 2050 is, I am so pleased to introduce Megan Reilly Cayten, all the way from New York, from Oceans 2050. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Megan, and then I will pass it over to her. It's impressive, so hold on to something. Megan has developed, financed, and managed projects to deliver positive impacts for people and the planet on 4 continents. She has a background in infrastructure development, finance, and asset management. She has founded, grew, and sold an impact-focused business with operations in Mexico and India. Her passion is climate restoration, with the goal of leaving our children a habitable planet. Megan is currently developing a renewable energy project in the Caribbean and also advises companies and projects on climate and carbon offset strategy, ESG, and impact. She chairs the board of the National Environmental Education Foundation and is a board member of the Fondo Nacional Para. Oh, I'm sorry, Megan, you're going to have to tell me about this one in Mexico, and another one in Honduras. And she's on the National Council of the World Wildlife Fund. Megan, I'll let you correct my pronunciation of those last 2. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was really kind. And I think I meant that as a bio to go out. I certainly didn't mean it to be read. I hope it wasn't too much for folks, but I am here in my capacity as Chief Commercial Officer of Oceans 2050, which is the project the lead for the seaweed carbon farming project, which Cascadia Seaweed is a really important part of. So I am now going to share my screen and let's see if this works. And I'll talk to you for about 20 minutes. I've got a lot of slides, and partly because I wanted to cover a lot of ground and then just see what folks are interested in. So I'll keep it pretty high level, and then we can go back into detail on anything that folks are interested in. So Kennedy, I'm going to assume that folks can see my slides. Just somebody speak up if you can't. So I'm here to talk about the seaweed carbon farming project. And now I'm not advancing. There's always something. Let's see. There we go. And our project is, it's the first project of a group called Oceans 2050. So this is a bit about it. We're a new initiative.
Megan, before you begin, it's Kennedy here.
Of course.
Can you put it in presenter view, please?
I thought I was. That's what I'm seeing. So I apologize. Of course I can. Let's try it again.
Perfect. Thank
Amazing.
You
sorry. It means that I see the backwards of what you guys see. I'm sorry about that. I thought it was correct. Thank you. All right. So Oceans 2050 is a new initiative. We're just a year old. And the goal is to restore abundance to the oceans in one human generation. So restore in one generation what it took us 3 to destroy. Folks who are listening probably know that we've lost about 50% of our blue natural capital, and we have about 10 years left to try not to lose the rest. And Oceans 2050 was born out of a frustration with what conservation and sustainability have wrought for the oceans, and a desire to do more, and a belief that we know of the ocean's capacity to regenerate. And it is a moral responsibility as well as a scientific imperative that we deliver that. We know it's economically viable. We know how to do it. What we lack is the political will. And so our focus is really on abundance, and that differentiates a bit from other groups. Our founders are Alexandre Cousteau. She's Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter. There are 3 sets of brother-sister Cousteau pairs. So to place her father was Philippe, who was killed in a plane crash when she was young. This is really her vision, and it arose from her frustration with what she's seen happen to the oceans over her lifetime. She reached out to Professor Carlos Duarte, who is one of the world's leading marine biologists, also happens to be one of the world's seaweed experts, the expert on seaweed and carbon, and asked him if it was a foregone conclusion that the oceans would die during her lifetime. And he said, actually, no, we know how to regenerate the oceans. And I'm writing a paper on it. And so his paper is really the foundation of what Oceans 2050 does. We exist to operationalize his science. Professor Duarte, in this piece, which is called Rebuilding Marine Life, that was published in Nature magazine last year, articulates a number of key recovery wedges or ecosystems to focus on, or areas of focus that are crucial to rebuilding abundance in our oceans. And you can see here the ones that affect seaweed, our ocean forests, and blue carbon. And we decided, and regenerative aquaculture to some extent as well, obviously for seaweed farming. And we decided to start with seaweed farming as our initial area of focus because of its immense potential to be restorative to the oceans and to the climate. A piece here on the Oceans 2050 and our approach to climate. So if you see here CDR, for those for whom the lingo is new, it means carbon disposal and removal. And Ocean CDR is a new evolving field. Really, seaweed farming is the only scalable solution we have right now to reduce the CO2 loads in the ocean. And I wanted to just lay out here the role that Oceans 2050 plays with regard to climate. We know that the oceans have absorbed about 30% of the carbon dioxide emitted by humans since the Industrial Revolution at immense cost. That's why we know that at our current course, all coral reefs will be degraded by 2030. That's in 9 years. That's basically now. But what some folks don't know is that all of that CO2 that's been absorbed by the oceans because of the way that carbon balances work, whenever we're successful at reducing atmospheric loads of concentration of carbon dioxide, is just going to come right back out again. So if we don't do something about CO2 loads in the oceans, we're setting ourselves up for failure on the atmospheric side. And so because of that, and because we know that the oceans and the climate crises are inextricably linked, we are particularly interested in pursuing projects that are meaningful for restoration of both the oceans and of the climate. And I'm proud to say here that the Seaweed Carbon Farming Project I'm talking to you about today was named a finalist for the Keeling Curve Prize. And we are the only ocean solution. So we're very hopeful that we will come through with that prize and have some ideas about how we will use it to advance seaweed farming. As I mentioned, this is our first project. It is a three-part project. So part one is to advance the scientific understanding of the sequestration by macroalgae of carbon in sediment. The basic operating principle is that a portion of the biomass of seaweed, wherever it grows, whether it's in a forest or on a farm, breaks off during the growing period, and a portion of the carbon in that biomass is permanently sequestered in the oceans. We know that it may be sequestered in deep sea caverns or in seagrass meadows or in sediments underneath the farm. And Professor Duarte has demonstrated that through his history of scientific work. But we want to be able to trace the carbon back to the specific seaweed that generated it so that we can create a market around it. And because of that, our science is focused only on sedimentation underneath farms, which means we're focusing only on farms in relatively protected areas, because in more exposed areas, the sediment can travel up to 5,000 kilometers away. The scientific results are underway, and I'll get on to I'll do a schedule update a little bit later, but the science launched in September of 2020. The next phase that we are just starting with now is to create a new, what is conventionally called a protocol. The technical term is a verified carbon methodology, and that is a tool in the voluntary carbon market through which the seaweed farmers will be able to monetize the carbon impact of their farm. And finally, we want to do the first project to use that methodology so that we can demonstrate best practices in terms of governance and really launch the market. I wanted to just say a word here about the carbon removal potential of seaweed because it comes up. It's a very open question. There's a reason we're doing this science. It's something we don't know that much about. The person who knows most about it on Earth probably is Carlos Duarte, and he knows his own limitations in terms of the science that he's been able to do. So I put here the available estimates for carbon removal that have been published in the literature. Also the available estimates for carbon capture. So that's how much carbon is absorbed by the seaweed during the growing process. Obviously, it may end up somewhere else in the oceans, in the air, after people eat the biomass, wherever. So removal is really what we're focused on. And just a statement here that the inputs, when we talk about seaweed, seaweed is a very varied thing. There's 70-odd thousand species of it. We cultivate about a dozen of them all around the world. And it can obviously vary in yield, the percentage, dry weight of wet, the carbon content. You all probably know, being associated with Cascadia, that seaweed farmers do not measure their farm size by area. They measure it by line length. So all of these things that we're using are incredibly crude metrics, but they're what we have. And so I like to put it out there for people's reference. In terms of the potential of seaweed to remove carbon, so much depends on how much carbon it's removing today, which is a question we're hoping to answer with our study. A lot depends on how we're able to optimize seaweed farms to remove more carbon in the future, which we have a lot of ideas about. And then finally, a huge amount depends on how quickly we're able to scale up seaweed farming, which depends ultimately on ultimate beneficial use of that biomass and there being markets for the products. So obviously these are huge hypotheticals and I want to put it in that category. But I wanted to put here what we're comfortable saying. We also have an earth-shut scenario in which seaweed carbon can sequester as much carbon, about 10 gigatons of carbon cumulatively over the 30 years from 2020 to 2050. We think that's possible, which makes it a pretty meaningful nature-based solution to climate change, and currently the only one we have for the oceans. When you think about how big could seaweed farming get, we're starting from an area of under 2,000 kilometers today, square kilometers, excuse me. The UCSB has published a study saying that there are 48 million square kilometers, excuse me, of ocean suitable for seaweed farming. We estimate that the area, if you were to limit that potential by relying only on anthropogenic sources of phosphorus and nitrogen, it's about 3.5 million square kilometers. Needless to say, many orders of magnitude larger than where we are today. So there's lots of room. You all, being fans of seaweed, probably know some of this, but just to put in one place, the ecosystem benefits of seaweed, which are profound. There are the climate mitigation benefits in terms of carbon removal. There are avoided and negative emissions benefits based on what you use the biomass for, including enhancing soil carbon, using it for biostimulants, reducing enteric methane emissions. There are also a lot of climate adaptation benefits in terms of localized reduction of acidification and temperature, which fosters biodiversity, supportive fisheries by providing habitat, and oxygen inputs to coastal waters. You can use seaweed farming to reverse dead zones. This is our seaweed carbon farming project, and you can see Cascadia up here. Look at that, you guys are number 1. We have 21 seaweed farms. I believe it's actually now 22 in 12 countries on 5 continents. And we deliberately included a wide array of seaweed species, a wide array of locations, diversity in age. Our oldest farm is 300 years old. It's been continuously farmed in the same location in Japan. Our youngest, I think, is Cascadia, or it's either Cascadia or Atlantic Sea Farms in Maine. We have farms that can be seen from space. Our Chinese farm is 150 square kilometers. And then we have, the tiny little ones that we happen to have on this continent. So we have really a range. And the goal is to have all of that input so that we can identify what the drivers are of carbon removal. We're participating with 19 different scientific organizations to help do the sampling. And we're working with 3 laboratories, including the International Atomic Energy Agency in Monaco, to do radiocarbon dating of the sediment, which I will get into in just one moment. Here's the status of which, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit tiny, but just to give you a sense that the sampling process has been somewhat delayed through because of COVID. My understanding is that Cascadia sent their samples in I think last month. So we're on track, hopefully, to be releasing some results at the end of the summer or early fall. In terms of what we're actually doing, we're taking sediment cores from underneath seaweed farms and radiocarbon dating them. So if you can imagine, I like to use the analogy of rings in a tree, carbon being deposited over time by seaweed biomass, and we will be able, hopefully, to identify that carbon when it was deposited and where it came from. We are taking those cores down back to before the farm was established. We're also taking cores from what we call control farms to try to understand the impact of those seaweed farms on the carbon in the sediment below them. And as I mentioned, we'll then be radiocarbon dating them for the carbon piece. We also have two separate projects in which a subset of farms are participating. One is doing eDNA analysis of sediment to understand the biodiversity impact of farms, and another one is looking for microplastics. Once we finish the science, if you remember back at the beginning, we will then start on the protocol writing. So that's the methodology development piece here. You can see in the second bucket. And then the rest of it there, the project design document, and thereafter, that is what will happen when we're able to create the first project. The first project needs to operate for 12 months before we're able to issue credits. So the earliest we expect to see the first seaweed credits on the market is Q1 of 2023. I have some slides here on the carbon markets. I think I'm just going to move quickly through it in the interest of time. But if there are questions, I'm happy to go back just to outline that they're compliance carbon markets, which is, regulatory requirements. So that's the EU emissions trading system and the WCI, which California and parts of Canada are a part of. And then there are voluntary markets. We are focused on the voluntary market. The voluntary carbon market has about $300 million market value. And it's a series of bilateral transactions between buyers and sellers. So if you hear corporates making net zero commitments, this is often where they're going to honor that commitment. Because it's a series of bilateral transactions, it's not transparent and it often makes no sense. And so it causes a lot of confusion. And I'm happy to answer some questions around it, but it has, I think, a lot of potential. If you look at where the market was in 2019, which is the latest year we have data for it, again, because it's not such a transparent market, the project types in it are predominantly renewable energy and forestry. Renewable energy is being phased out. And there is extremely strong interest in blue carbon solutions and virtually no blue carbon credits on the market today. I'm doing an inventory actually of projects, and we believe there are 5 projects currently issuing credits anywhere in the world. In terms of what seaweed has to offer in the voluntary carbon market compared to other assets. One thing that's really exciting about it is if you think about a mangrove carbon project, it has to rely solely on carbon revenues, and it's pretty expensive and painstaking to restore mangroves. It's one of the reasons why there are only, as I mentioned, we believe about 5 projects emitting credits today, partly because of historically lower prices, which we hope will be rectified soon. Prices are definitely going up, but partly because you have to rely completely on carbon revenues to pay for the project. In the case of seaweed farms, hopefully the seaweed farmers are already making money and the carbon revenues are additional. And that means this is scalable in a way that other blue carbon solutions may not be. The carbon removal from seaweed is compatible with ongoing productive use. Because the carbon removal happens from biomass that breaks off, you can keep harvesting all the biomass you were previously harvesting and keep doing whatever you were doing with it, and the carbon removal still happens. So that is, for example, a distinction with timber, with terrestrial forest credits. We expect there'll be a premium price. There's a real premium right now placed on blue carbon. And we know that because this is new and exciting and it's what's called charismatic in the carbon market, it has lots of good stories, lots of good co-benefits, great for livelihood stories. It has a gender equity story, maybe a food security story. We expect that they'll price pretty high. And I'm actually increasing my estimates this year over last year based on where the market is. It has some challenges. Seaweed farms and projects are, seaweed farms are small, so seaweed projects are going to be pretty small. And so you need to figure out how to aggregate those in a way that justifies the transaction costs of the carbon project. We need to figure out how to validate this in a way that doesn't require every farm that wants to issue credits to go through the painstaking scientific process we're going through today. We're working on that. And we also need for the third-party validation professionals to have the expertise to go out and know something about seaweed. Right now, they know a lot about trees or mangroves, but because this is new, we need to do some capacity building in that space, and that's an area we're also active in. And then I do want to emphasize that our methodology will only apply to farms with sediment within 100 meters because we don't think it's currently possible to trace the carbon deposition over a wider area. And so that means offshore farms or more exposed areas or kelp forests would not be eligible under this methodology. Just looking at time, I'm almost there. People ask me often, what is the biggest barrier to scaling up seaweed as a carbon solution? And I would actually say the biggest barrier is scaling up seaweed demand. If we're going to grow all this seaweed, and if we want to grow a lot of seaweed so that we can remove a lot of carbon during the growing period, we got to figure out something to do with that seaweed. We at Oceans 2050 are not proponents of purposeful deep sea sinking of seaweed because of ecosystem and negative ecosystem impact concerns. We think it's great that people are evaluating that in experiments starting this year. But assuming you're not going to sink it, what else are you going to do with it? And obviously, it would be wonderful for there to be higher value-added products across the board, whether they have good climate impacts or not. So to us, the biggest barrier to scaling up seaweed farming is really demand for higher value products. Seaweed farming is an industry of the poor today. All of the seaweed is, 99% plus of the biomass is produced in Asia. It's pretty low margin, pretty artisanal, pretty much all used for food or hydrocolloids. And in order for us to get to a scale where we'll be having a meaningful carbon impact, we need to develop a different model in the West. There's some other limitations here that I've listed out that I'd be happy to talk about if people are more interested. In terms of innovation and investment, again, I know you guys are talking a lot about seaweed broadly, so I wanted to really focus on seaweed and carbon here. These are some areas that we've identified that we think are really meaningful to move this market forward. We really need technology to identify and quantify carbon stocks and to do the long-term monitoring, reporting, and verification of seaweed farms. If anyone is paying attention to what's happening on the terrestrial side, you've got groups like Sylvia Terra or Pachamama that are using satellites and drones and LiDAR to quantify carbon, and AI actually to quantify carbon stocks from the air in a way that is much more efficient than the way that we currently do it, which can be painstaking and involve, physical visits from folks with measuring tapes and that kind of thing, which is just not scalable. No one is doing that on the ocean, and we desperately need it. We need thoughts around farm life cycle carbon optimization. So once we understand what the carbon drivers are from the study, we would like to help think through what would be a carbon optimized farm. So what are the drivers? If the farm needs to be older, there's not very much we can do to speed that up. But if a driver is size, we can go bigger. If a driver is farming techniques, we can change them. If it's species, perhaps we can do species selection. So I think there's a lot more work to be done that we would like to do, to be at the forefront of. I mentioned the challenges of tracing sedimentation over long distances. That's really going to be core to making sure that the carbon impacts of offshore farms and kelp forests are quantified. And then I wanted to mention that we want to go beyond the voluntary market. We see it as a stepping stone to the compliance markets eventually. And so we will be exploring the potential to qualify seaweed farming in a compliance market starting next year, most likely starting with Korea. But obviously, if seaweed farming can be included in the IPCC process and countries can include it as part of their nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, again, that will give it even more impetus. And then there's some other areas here where we think there is definitely room for growth. If folks are interested in more resources, that's our website. So oceans2050.com/seaweed is on our project. The second link, which I'll also put in the chat, is a series of, it's a curated set of scientific papers on the ecosystem services of seaweed, including carbon, but not limited to carbon, and a couple different other papers about potential uses of seaweed and their carbon implications, and then some broader material on seaweed. I do a lot of investor education around the potential of seaweed and carbon. And so I've correlated that for investors and would obviously be happy for anyone to take a look. You do need to create an account, but it's free. So please feel free to check that out. And please feel free to reach out to me with any questions that don't get answered today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. You have blown my mind. That was a lot of information in a very short period of time. So I can tell you've done this presentation a couple of times before. There's quite a few questions. And this one, I know you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about it. And I'm hoping this will go back to what you're going to do with the research once you have completed it. And just on a side note, you can stop sharing your screen now, and that's perfect. Good. So the question is, from your presentation, Megan, it appears that seaweed farming is not just one solution to climate change, but an essential, necessary step that we cannot afford to ignore. How are governments supporting seaweed farming to enact this vital step?
Amen. Who'd you set up with that question or that comment? I agree. What are governments doing? I would say it's a hodgepodge. I've been in touch with Carrie's office and with folks at state to really try to make sure oceans are part of the agenda in the US. And I'm speaking to you from New York, so that's why I started there. I think that historically, the ocean conservation and ocean health community and the climate community have not really talked to each other. And so there's really a lot of room for improvement. There are folks like Ocean Visions and the Ocean Climate Alliance who are doing a lot of work to prepare roadmaps for government about policy solutions and things that need to be done for ocean CDR in general, of which seaweed is currently, as I mentioned, the only existing and scalable solution, even if it's not eventually going to be the biggest one. So I think the recommendation's out there, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. I'm not familiar necessarily with what the Canadian government is doing, so I'm going to take a pass on that one. In the EU, there is actually a huge amount of interest in seaweed. We are part of a submission, I think just one of maybe 4 or 5 seaweed submissions for funding under what's called Horizons 2020. It's the European Green New Deal funding. And ours is focused on quantifying and creating markets for ecosystem services for seaweed. But there are others. There's another one called Genie Algae, which is producing, they actually have EU funding to do small commercial scale cascading biorefineries, which are desperately needed to produce more high value products to enhance the efficiency of processing. And there's others. So there's a lot of EU funding in the space. The UK government, prior to COP, when they want to make COP26 the nature-based COP, and they really want to focus on their coastline, because that's something that the UK has to offer, has a lot of interest in seaweed. And I've been getting kind of inundated in the last, actually even just a couple of days with folks who are interested in making sure that it's on the agenda. We're talking to the UNFCCC champion for the oceans who wants to make sure seaweed is on the agenda. And we actually have a little seaweed carbon group led by the UN Global Compact that's trying to make sure there's a narrative that goes into COP. So we're doing what we can. I would say in Asia, there are a couple really interesting, probably more advanced proposals because it's such a big industry. So Korea has a proposal to develop an entire ring of seaweed farms around all their aquaculture operations to clean up the waste, as well as hopefully provide some carbon benefits. Japan has a really interesting blue carbon scheme they've come up with. It's actually very specific to the Japanese market and very public sector dominated, that involves seaweed as well. They're real leaders on the scientific side of seaweed. So it's a hodgepodge of answers, but I think it's just new. And the only thing I would caution is one thing that concerns us is we see that the narrative that a lot of people are hearing around seaweed and carbon is grow a whole lot of it and sink it in the deep sea. And while that may prove to be a good solution, the marine biologists who I work with, whose opinion I respect on such things because I'm not a scientist, are very worried about the negative consequences to the deep sea ecosystem. So it's great that people are doing experiments to figure that out. But we just want to make sure the narrative gets out there that there's a seaweed carbon story that's entirely compatible with growing farms like Cascadia's and continuing to farm seaweed the way we do today and just scaling it up. We don't have to ditch the biomass. We can use it for things. And if we use it for things, they have their own climate benefits, to your point.
I would be not a marketer if I didn't do a plug for the consumer-facing brand that we just launched yesterday called Cove. There it is. And this is what we're doing with our harvest from this season and future seasons is nutritious and delicious, sustainable snack products for the North American market, made right here with British Columbia seaweed. So that's our plug. Desiree, if you're out there, that's for you. A couple more, well, lots of questions coming through here. What is the best way to keep opportunities in carbon monetization real and valid and avoid the hype?
I like these questions. I should do conferences in Canada more often. You guys get to the point. Well, it's something we're concerned about. So as I mentioned, there are folks who are sinking seaweed in the deep sea, some folks who are saying they're selling seaweed credits today. As I just want to be clear, people have their questions about the voluntary market and about its integrity. And I've been working in the market for 20 years. I share those concerns. I still think it's an important tool. But for anyone who's selling seaweed credits today, is kind of selling smoke at the end of the day. I mean, what you can do is what you can do is take the latest science, estimate the carbon impact of whatever work you're doing, put a price tag on it, and divide one number by the other, so you have $1 per ton. I think people I hope they'll be clear that that's your estimate, and it's an incredibly worthy thing to do. And I have zero doubt that you're producing a wonderful carbon benefit, and people should pay for that. But the voluntary market does have a system of writing these methodologies. So you have to have science. The science has to be peer reviewed. You have to write a methodology that meets the criteria of the accreditors. So groups like Vera, for example, who we're working with, they require those methodologies to be conservative. So whatever you say you're going to do, I don't know, they probably cut it in half, right? They have a variety of different techniques and tools they use, and they rely on third-party scientists as well to make sure that those methodologies are credible, so that that if you do something, it will have this kind of carbon impact. So I would just encourage folks to, whenever we have this information, to get it out there that this is building a real voluntary carbon market around it, and then point folks towards people who are selling seaweed credits that are verified and third-party certified. The way is if they're retirable, if you're able to retire them to meet your carbon commitments, or if they're monetizable, if you're able to sell them, that's a credit that exists in the voluntary market. It's not perfect. A regulated market would be much clearer, but we don't have one. So I think that's really the most important thing we can do, is to keep asking people to advance the science and make sure that whatever they're selling is supported by the best available market structure today.
Megan, you talked a little bit about consumer products doing something with the seaweed. There's some concerns in the chat about the carbon that's released back into the atmosphere once it's been processed. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there are a couple different use cases we can envision for seaweed. So one of them is food, right? That's what we do with it today. So when we eat it, it gets released back to the atmosphere. We know that. You could make a carbon case that you have reduced your emissions if you could explain that someone is eating seaweed instead of cows. kind of a hard argument to make probably in most cases. It might be easier in animal feed where you can actually measure exactly what cows eat and they don't get to control it much. So you could be more precise about it. And where there are other benefits. So productivity enhancement from brown seaweeds, which you can measure. Enteric methane reduction is obviously potentially quite meaningful from sugar kelp as well as other seaweeds. So each of those different pathways will have a different carbon impact. And I mentioned also, if you were to use seaweed for biostimulants to enhance soil carbon, to enhance the resistance of terrestrial crops to drought, salt, or heat, that's yet another really good climate story to tell. So we actually see that you could stack the carbon revenues. So you could start with carbon removal from the farm, and you need to net off from that carbon removal impact your carbon emissions. So that provides an incentive for farms to hopefully buy electric boats or whatever that you probably want to do anyway, but you can't necessarily afford. Hopefully this is a monetary incentive to help encourage that. But then to pile on top, whatever you use the biomass for could also generate its own credit. And then you have to figure out who gets it. Does the farmer get it? Does the person who sold the animal feed get it? Does the farmer who fed the feed to the cow get it? Right? Probably the cow doesn't get it. So there are things to be worked out. The good news is there are use cases in the voluntary carbon market. There are already methodologies, for every use case we can think of. So if you were to use seaweed for biopolymers, for example, for plastics, there already is a corn-based biopolymer methodology. So we just need to adapt it to seaweed. So there's a lot of potential, and we'd really like to do life cycle carbon analyses around each of these use cases to try to direct folks towards, if you want to have a seaweed farm that has the maximum impact, how do you decide what to do with your biomass, right? I suspect it's probably biochar, but there are probably, a variety of different things. But to get back to your original question, I think it'd be very hard to sell carbon credits from seaweed that's used for food because it does end up back in the atmosphere. But that does not mean you cannot sell carbon credits from carbon removal that happens during the growing period. Those are two separate things. And that's one of the things that's so great about seaweed. If you compare it to a forest, you got to choose whether you cut the tree down and sell it for timber or you leave it growing and you sell the carbon. In the case of seaweed, you can do both.
That's great. I'm going to try to combine two questions here into one and give you a chance to speak about it. There's folks who are wanting to start out in the seaweed farming industry, and they're wondering if monetizing seaweed for carbon credits could help them leverage up their business. And also another question is, how can these small farms make a difference?
I love it. I mean, one of the things that's so exciting to us about seaweed farming, and I'm speaking for myself and for Alexandra, she spent most of her life talking. I'm just going to see if that lighting is any better. No, it's not. She spent most of her life talking to out of work fishers and other folks who have spent their life on the oceans and have maybe fished their oceans dry, and they want nothing more than to continue working on the oceans. And one of the things that we love about seaweed farming is that you can farm it at a small scale. It's a relatively low barrier to entry business. I mean, says me, right, sitting here in New York. I am told, for someone who actually knows how to work on the water. And it's accessible to indigenous groups, to communities, rural, coastal communities, and very accessible to women, right? We know that more than 50% of seaweed farmers in a lot of the markets where we work are women. So small farms have a hugely important role to play, I think, in growing this industry. We need also big farms so that we can get to a point where seaweed is a commodity that it can displace fossil fuel-based plastics or soy animal feed or a lot of the other things that are trashing the planet. So we really see that there's a role for both, that smaller farms can create maybe more of a niche luxury product, and those maybe larger offshore farms that are probably going to end up being automated can provide more of a commodity input, and that you need to have space for both. And we're very committed to building a market in which that is the case. In terms of carbon credits being a financing source to get a farm off the ground, it takes about 5 years for a farm to generate enough carbon for it to be measurable in the sediment. So you're not going to have any probably carbon impact year 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I don't know how big your carbon impact is going to be year 5, but you can look at our studies. And if you've got any seaweed farm that is comparable in terms of species or location or whatever else, then we'll hopefully be able to give you some guidance. One important thing to note for those farmers is we will be publishing in about 3 months an open access set of protocols for sampling for any farm that any farmer can use anywhere. And we're also going to include in there, because we get this question a lot, if you are a new farm, what is the thing that you should do before you start so you can establish your baseline? That's, that's a luxury we don't have with the farms we're working with today, because we're obviously working with existing farms. But if you are starting up from nothing, you could actually do the sediment analysis before you start, and then you'll have your baseline. You do it then again 5 years later, and that will be really, hopefully, conclusive science to show your carbon impact. We hope that once this methodology is approved, people will be able to enter into forward carbon credit sale contracts. They're called emission reductions purchase agreements usually. So one example of that, I work with a forestry client. When they plant trees, they know that the carbon impact of those trees will not be sufficient enough for a carbon project for 10 years. But people will pay them today for carbon credits to be delivered in year 10. Obviously, if the trees don't burn down and various other things, right? Seaweed doesn't burn down, another benefit. So I'm hopeful that for farms, certainly not this year because the methodology hasn't been approved, but I'm hopeful that as for farms that are starting up maybe next year or the year after, they might be in a position to find folks to whom they could pre-sell some credits, even if they're not a lot. And my advice would be, if you're a small farm, try to find other farms you can aggregate with, so you get to a carbon credit number that's worth paying folks. At the moment, you have to pay somebody maybe 20 grand to write a project design document. You've got to pay third-party verifiers to come out and measure your farm and look at your harvest and make sure your farm exists. We're hopeful that with some of that technology, we can make that process more efficient, so it'll be cheaper, but there are some costs associated with it. And obviously it doesn't make sense to sell carbon credits at a loss. But I am really, really hopeful that we're going to start seeing prices above $20 for seaweed credits, which would be amazing. So for comparison, quality land-based tons have been at about $5 for 20 years in the voluntary market. I've got a client who's paying 61 cents for old Indian renewable energy. The EU ETS has hit 47 euros. That's the regulated price, which is crazy. The California price is comparable. So, well, it's on its way up. So I'm really hopeful that we're going to see, with all this corporate interest, some real upward pressure on prices, which would hopefully make that transaction more viable for a smaller farm.
Yeah, most definitely. We need that. There's a couple of questions about the disadvantages to growing seaweed just to cut off of the farm and let sink into the deep ocean. Are you comfortable talking to that? What are the concerns about that? What are the,
Sure. Yeah, we know that a portion of as I mentioned, probably most of the carbon impact of a seaweed farm or forest does end up in the deep sea. Professor Duarte has demonstrated that by doing the DNA analysis of sediments that he finds there. And you can find some of those papers on that link that I shared. So I'm not suggesting that deep sea sinking is not, the deep sea deposition is not a meaningful carbon impact. I think it definitely is. The challenge is, as I mentioned, you can figure out the species of the macroalgae that was behind that carbon, but you can't tell where it came from with any degree of certainty right now because of the distances that it might have traveled in the ocean. So natural deep sea sinking is great. There are probably some ways to enhance it somewhat. But the concern with what's being proposed, which is growing at large scale and sinking the farms in their entirety to the deep sea, the premise, which makes sense, is if you get below, I believe it's 1,000 meters, the assumption is because of the way the thermoclines work, the CO2 will then stay below that barrier for a very extended period of time. So you can feel pretty confident it won't come back up to the surface. The concern that Professor Duarte has and other marine biologists share is that the benthic or the deep sea environments where you'll be sinking that seaweed are not necessarily very well understood. And the concern is that you'll be creating anoxic conditions that foster the growth of bacteria that could be detrimental to those deep sea ecosystems, which are pretty fragile. Again, if you do this at massive scale. I think the experiment that's happening this summer, I believe, is maybe 1,000 tons, if that's right. So again, hopefully that will be something that we learn something from. I think another concern is that Professor Duarte has is that it could take up to a decade for those environmental consequences to manifest. And so if we decide after year one that we're good, maybe we're not. Those are Professor Duarte's concerns. We 100% endorse doing the experiments to figure this stuff out. No one knows for sure, but he just has that concern.
That's right.
And again, I would say he also feels that it's incompatible, right, with using the biomass for other things. There's so many good things you can use the seaweed biomass for. So I think also from his perspective as a lover of seaweed, he sees it as a waste.
Okay, good. Thanks for sharing that perspective. I wanted to get to know you a little bit more, Megan. What was the trigger point in your life when you realized we were in a climate crisis and you had to do something about it?
So it was early. I was an overly thoughtful child. I remember being very stressed out about turning 10 because I thought I was, close to death, right? It was perhaps morbid. But I grew up in an environmental family, and I went to school on a farm where we knew how we watched how our sewage was processed, and we fed cows and goats. And actually goats used to wander through my kindergarten and eat my paintings off the easel. So I think I was raised with a real strong understanding of at least environmental cycles. My father was actually EPA administrator under the administration of Bush 41 and fought very hard. There's a whole book that was written by Nathaniel Rich, called Losing Something. I'm sorry, I wasn't prepared for this question, but it came out last year. And it actually articulates the period under my father's administration, which was the last time we had where really the globe was poised to do something on climate, but we didn't. And since then, we've done kind of nothing, at least from speaking from the perspective of my country, which has obviously been holding us back and is responsible for 25% of the CO2 in the atmosphere. So I would say I knew about it from a very young age. I found it very scary. I didn't think I could do anything about it. Excuse my doorbell. Didn't think I could do anything about it. And I was really dedicated to making things work in the private sector, because I'm a big believer that you need to bring in return-seeking capital to scale up solutions. Thank you for putting that in the chat. Losing Earth, exactly. And so I did a variety of climate mitigation projects, what I would consider them to be. So that's why I'm building a renewable energy project in the Caribbean. I've been in energy my whole life because that's where I could do climate at the core of the work that I do, as opposed to being, a risk manager or an internal lobbyist. And I'm not cut out to be an academic, so I would say that's it. And I finally, I think, had a real realization when my children, when I started having kids, of what kind of a planet was I actually leaving them? Was it even a good idea to have kids? Are they going to feel like they can have kids? Is this a responsible thing to do? And how can there be anything more important or existential than leaving our kids at home? So that is when I refocused 100% on climate. And when I found this through a long friendship with Alexandra, I found seaweed farming, got really excited about it, and decided we had something catalytic to offer here. And so it's been a real pleasure to hopefully move the needle forward a little bit.
That's what this whole festival is about, educating people, inspiring people, creating more seaweed enthusiasts around the world. So people feel a sense of hope for the future, that having children isn't the bad decision, that there is a planet for them to live and thrive on. As we go forward, I just want to ask you one more question, and then we'll wrap up. What would you say to our audience today if they could only do one thing to help the climate, to save the world? What would you do?
Oh, goodness. Well, I did want to just respond to your last point and say that Alexandra and Carlos 100% agree. One of the reasons we created Oceans 2050 was to let people know we actually know how to fix this problem. If you poll people on what the state of the oceans is today, a lot of them will say that what we think are the worst case projections for 2050 have already happened. They think we already have more plastics than fish, that the coral reefs are already gone, right? So much of what we're trying to say is, no, there is hope. We know how to fix this, but we've got to do it. So I'm really excited that you're on board and creating more seaweed enthusiasts. I have never yet met anyone who learned something about seaweed and didn't want to learn more. So I hope that you're cultivating more and more of them. In terms of the number one thing you can do, if you're an American, vote. We need American leadership on climate, and we need it in the Congress. America's has been for the last 4 years holding the planet back and facing this existential crisis. We are responsible for the largest amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's our obligation to clean it up. And we historically have not had leadership that represented that. So I feel incredibly strongly about that. Anywhere else, I would say think really consciously about everything that you buy. I know that's probably a trite thing to say, but everything has a carbon footprint. Everything has a story. And when you find a product like seaweed that has done so much good for the oceans, for all the creatures that live in the oceans, and for people and the farmers who farmed it, I think you can feel really, really good about it. So maybe that entices you to eat a little bit less red meat, or maybe red meat that's been regeneratively ranched, or think about your food consumption as well as all of your other consumption as a way to send signals about what you care about in the world. And I think that's going to help us particularly in the West where we're very consumer focused. I think that helps drive change, and certainly I hope helps support companies like Cascadia that are producing that carbon removal upstream, but need someone to buy the products, or we won't. To my point, if we don't have folks buying seaweed, we won't be able to remove it from the carbon from the ocean. So if that's your motivation, buy a lot of seaweed.
Yeah, and find out where your seaweed comes from. And that was a huge motivator for us, was to provide this sustainable snack product that's grown right here in British Columbia to the North American market, therefore cutting out all those transportation costs and things as well. So Megan,
higher quality seaweed. Just another plug. I actually haven't even tried the new product, so I don't want to sound, I'm your marketer now, but I am a 100% volunteer marketer, because so much of the seaweed, if folks are feeding seaweed snacks to their kids, which I do, that seaweed is dried, maybe dyed green. The seaweed salad that you get in a restaurant is often dyed green with commercial dyes. And it's imported from a really long way away, and you don't necessarily know what's in it. So if you're worried about quality, buy local.
Let's not even talk about the packaging.
A whole nother thing. And I don't know if folks saw, actually, on the seaweed and packaging front, Oceanium, which is a seaweed biopolymer company, just closed a $3 million round yesterday with a bunch of investment. We know them well. And I don't mean to endorse them. There are a number of really exciting seaweed biopolymer companies, but it's exciting, to see that happen. And again, consumers have got to demand it, and we've got to be willing to pay for it, or the companies do, or we won't get there. But that would be a solution that grows a lot of seaweed and produces, also addresses the plastics crisis in the ocean.
Yes, we have NOTPLA presenting tomorrow, actually. NOTPLA's presenting tomorrow.
They're
Megan,
wonderful. Yeah, they're great.
Awesome. I think we could chat for another whole hour, but this has been great. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to Vaia. Thanks for all the great questions. Megan, if you could just stay on for a moment, that would be really great. And we'll see you all soon. Oh.